Hello guys, welcome to this video on introduction to thoracic anatomy. So we'll follow the following outline. We'll start with an overview of the thorax. Secondly, we'll go to the thoracic cavity. Then the very important angle of Lewis, also called the sternal angle or mandibulo-sternal junction. Then we'll talk about the thoracic wall. So here we'll focus on the osteology or the bony makeup of this wall, which has three groups of bones: the sternum, the ribs, and the 12 thoracic vertebrae. Then we shall end this with the arterial supply of the thoracic wall. Okay, so let's dive in. Okay, the chest, properly called the thorax in anatomy, is the superior part of the trunk located between the neck and the abdomen. So it consists of several components. You have the thoracic wall, cavities like the pleural cavities, neurovascular bundle, the nerve, vein, the arteries, the lymphatics, the internal organs such as the heart, the lungs, and the breast, of course, which are more prominent in women. Alright, so the thorax is an irregularly shaped cylinder and it has two major openings. The openings are right here demarcated in red: the superior thoracic aperture and an inferior thoracic aperture. So these two apertures, they allow communication of structures between the neck, the thorax, and the abdomen. So they have borders, which are very important to know. So the superior thoracic aperture, also called the thoracic inlet, is bounded anteriorly by the jugular notch of the mandible of the sternum, laterally by the first rib and its costal cartilage, and posteriorly by the first thoracic vertebrae. The inferior thoracic aperture, also called thoracic outlet, is bounded anteriorly by the xiphisternal joint, posteriorly by the 12 thoracic vertebrae, anterolaterally by the costal margin, and posterolaterally by the 11th and 12th rib. Okay, so now let's talk about the thoracic cavity. So the thoracic cavity has the shape of a truncated cone, as we can see right here. So this cavity can be further divided into three subcavities: laterally on either side, a right and a left pleural cavity which harbors the lung, and then the third cavity, which is at the middle, at the center, the mediastinum. So this mediastinum is where the heart sits, precisely in the middle mediastinum. Okay, so the mediastinum can be further divided by the angle of Lewis that we're going to see in a short while into a superior mediastinum here in green and an inferior mediastinum. So now the pericardium further divides the inferior mediastinum into an anterior mediastinum, a middle mediastinum, and a posterior mediastinum. Alright, so the angle of Lewis, or the sternal angle, or the mandibulo-sternal junction, is actually a junction between the fourth and the fifth thoracic vertebrae. So this superficial line here, so it demarcates the superior mediastinum right here from the inferior mediastinum. Okay, so there are very important events that take place at this angle of Lewis, which are very important to know. They are easily remembered using the mnemonic RAT plants. So R stands for the second rib. It's the site of articulation between the sternum and the second rib. A stands for the edge of the aorta. T for tracheal bifurcation. P for pulmonary bifurcation. L for left recurrent laryngeal nerve. A for the azygos system, N for the nerve of cardiac plexus, and T for the thoracic duct. So actually at this junction, the thoracic duct gives the right side to the left side of the thorax, where it empties into the left subclavian vein. Okay, so now the thoracic skeleton, also called the thoracic cage, has three main groups of bones, as we mentioned earlier. So most anteriorly we have the sternum, laterally on either side we have the 12 pairs of ribs, and posteriorly the 12 thoracic vertebrae. Okay, so let's start with the sternum. The sternum, also called the breastbone, is located in the midline anteriorly of the thorax, and it supports the rib cage anteriorly. It has three main divisions. So here are the divisions. First, we have the head, also called manubrium of the sternum, which have some important features. So we have the jugular notch. The jugular notch demarcates the boundary of the thoracic inlet, the anterior boundary. We have a clavicular notch for articulation with the clavicle. The first costal notch for articulation with the first rib. So here is the manubrium. So here is the sternal angle. Remember, angle of Lewis. So it separates the manubrium from the body of the sternum, and this junction is the sternal angle, mandibulo-sternal junction, or angle of Lewis, or mandibulo-sternal joint. So the body harbors many costal notches for the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh rib. So these are regions of articulations. The third part of the sternum is the xiphoid process. So remember, the sternum, three parts: the head or manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process. Okay, so now let's talk about the ribs. So the ribs, there are 12 pairs of ribs in the thoracic cage. So these ribs can be classified either based on their attachment to the sternum or based on the common features. So based on their attachment to the sternum, we can classify them as true ribs, false ribs, or floating ribs. So the true ribs are ribs 1, 2, 3 to 7. So you see that they are directly connected to the sternum via the costal cartilage. So it's a direct or a true connection. So true ribs. So the false ribs are the ribs 8, 9, and 10. So they are indirectly attached to the sternum because their costal cartilages, are joined to that of the seventh rib. So it's an indirect attachment to the sternum. That's why we call them false rib, a false attachment. So the ribs 11 and 12 are called floating ribs because they are not attached to the sternum in any way. Alright, so the second classification of the ribs, they are either typical or atypical. Typical if they possess the characteristic features of a rib, and then atypical if there is variation in these features. So the typical rib has the following characteristic. It has a head, a neck, and a body. So the head has three main parts: a superior articular facet, an inferior articular facet separated by a crest. So the neck right here joins the head to the body, and it possesses a tubercle, which is a site of articulation with the transverse process of the numerically corresponding vertebrae. So after the neck, you have the body. Here is the body. So the body has a costal groove. So this costal groove is where the neurovascular bundle runs. So from superficial to deep, or from superior to inferior, they are remembered with the mnemonic VAN: the intercostal vein, the artery, and then the intercostal nerve. So the atypical ribs are the first, second, 10th, 11th, and 12th ribs right here. So the first rib is atypical because it's not as curved as the other ribs. It's the shortest, the widest, and it's nearly horizontal. So that's one thing. The other thing that makes him atypical is that he has grooves for subclavian vein and artery separated by a scalene tubercle. So it's only on the first rib that you can see these grooves. Okay, so the second rib is atypical because he has a tuberosity for the serratus anterior muscle. So the 11, 10th, 11, and 12 ribs are atypical because they have only their head. The head of these ribs have only one facet. Remember that the head of a typical rib is supposed to have a superior articular facet, inferior articular facet separated by a crest. So the 10th, 11th, and 12th ribs, their heads have only one facet. Okay, so after the ribs, let's talk about the vertebrae. So the vertebrae, there are 12 thoracic vertebrae which are associated, they are joined to each other with the intervertebral disc. So these vertebrae, just like the ribs, can be classified as typical thoracic vertebrae or atypical thoracic vertebrae. So they are typical again if they have the features of a typical thoracic vertebrae, and atypical if there are variations in these features. So the typical thoracic vertebrae are the thoracic vertebrae 2 to 8, and they have a superior costal facet, inferior costal facet, and transverse costal facet. So you notice that there is a superior demi facet that will articulate with the superior articular facet of the rib, and then there is an inferior costal facet that will articulate with the inferior articular facet of the rib of corresponding number. So what distinguishes the thoracic vertebrae from the cervical or lumbar vertebrae, for example, is actually the presence of these facets. Remember that the ribs are only found in the thorax. So if you pick a vertebrae and you see this costal facet, you know that it is a thoracic vertebrae. Okay, so the atypical vertebrae they have variations mostly in the articular facets. So the first rib, you see it has a whole facet here, right here, but if you take with 2 to 8, you will notice that they have 2 demi facets, but the first rib has a whole facet. The 9th rib is also atypical because it has only a superior demi facet, there is no inferior demi facet. The 10th, 11th, and 12th ribs have a whole facet, so there is no superior and inferior. That also makes them atypical. Okay, so now let's talk about the arterial supply to the thoracic wall. So the arterial supply to the thoracic wall is derived from 3 main sources: from the aorta, the subclavian artery, and the axillary artery. So from the aorta arises the 3rd to 12th posterior intercostal arteries. So in red here, the 3rd to 12th posterior intercostal arteries. So the first 2 posterior intercostal arteries arise from the costocervical trunk, which is the first division of the subclavian artery. So the costocervical trunk gives rise to 2 branches. The branches of interest here is the supreme intercostal artery. So the supreme intercostal artery is the one that gives rise to the first 2 posterior intercostal arteries. So who says posterior? Say anterior. So this posterior intercostal arteries anastomose with anterior intercostal arteries in green here from the internal thoracic artery, previously called the internal mammary artery. So right here is the internal thoracic artery. It provides anterior intercostal arteries from the numbers 1 to 6. So at the 6th intercostal space, the internal thoracic artery is going to divide into 2. It's going to form a superior epigastric artery right here and a musculophrenic artery. So the musculophrenic artery is the one that will provide anterior intercostal arteries 7, 8, and 9. So after that, after the aorta, the sources from the aorta and the subclavian via the supreme intercostal arteries, let's talk about the sources arising from the axillary artery. So from the axillary artery, you have mainly the lateral thoracic artery that will supply the lateral aspect of the chest or of the thorax. So it will provide lateral mammary branches to the breast, and is also going to supply the pectoralis major and serratus anterior muscle. Alright guys, thank you for watching this video, and subscribe to our channel for more. I wish it was a great help to you, or it's going to help you Thank you, and don't forget to subscribe.